The sound of a child crying echoed faintly from behind a heavy wooden door. It was the kind of sound that pierced the stillness of a quiet evening, raw and desperate, filled with fear too great for someone so young. Emma's voice cracked between sobs as she called out for help, her small fists pounding on the door that refused to let her and her little brother out. Behind her trembling cries lay a secret the walls of that suburban Ohio home had been holding back for too long. Before we step into Emma's world, take a moment to subscribe to this channel so you never miss stories like this. Real stories of struggle, resilience, and the power of truth. Emma was 9 years old with big brown eyes that always seemed to hold more questions than answers. She lived in a modest neighborhood where lawns were neatly trimmed and neighbors greeted each other with a wave. From the outside, her home looked like any other in the row of houses that lined the quiet street. But inside, the air was often heavy with tension, especially since her father had remarried. Her father, Daniel, was a man of quiet strength. He worked long hours as an auto mechanic, his hands stained with grease and his back sore by the time he returned home each night. For Emma and her 6-year-old brother Jack, Daniel was both their anchor and their shield. He tucked them into bed when he could, read stories when he wasn't too tired, and reminded them in small gestures that he loved them. Yet his absence during the long days left a void others could easily manipulate. Valerie, their stepmother, had entered their lives less than 2 years earlier. At first she smiled warmly, her words coated in honey as she promised to care for Daniel's children as her own. But as the months passed, her warmth grew cold, her kindness replaced by sharp edges. To neighbors, she was polite, always dressed neatly, her hair perfectly arranged. But to Emma, Valerie was a shadow that loomed over every corner of the house, watching, criticizing, controlling. Emma remembered the comfort of her real mother, whose voice had been soft and gentle, whose touch had always reassured her that everything would be fine. That comfort was gone now, replaced with Valerie's cutting remarks and eyes that seemed to search for faults in every move Emma made. Jack, still too young to fully understand, clung to Emma like a lifeline. She became not just his sister, but his protector, the one who whispered to him that everything would be all right even when she herself wasn't sure. The first hints of trouble weren't dramatic. They were subtle, easy for outsiders to miss. Valerie might roll her eyes when Emma asked a question, or sigh impatiently when Jack spilled his milk at dinner. But Emma noticed, she always noticed, the way Valerie's smile vanished the moment Daniel left the room, the way silence settled over the house when it was just them. Despite the weight pressing on her small shoulders, Emma tried to hold on to hope. She believed that if she was patient, if she stayed quiet, things might get better. After all, her father seemed happy, and she didn't want to be the reason his smile disappeared. Yet in the quiet of her bedroom, lying awake at night, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was building, something that would test every bit of strength she had. It was only the beginning, but already Emma sensed her world was shifting in ways she couldn't control. And as her hand rested protectively on Jack's small shoulder, she whispered a promise she didn't yet know how to keep. "I'll always take care of you, no matter what." That night, as the cicadas hummed outside and the streetlights flickered over the peaceful neighborhood, Emma stared into the darkness, unaware that the worst was yet to come. Daniel always started his mornings before the sun came up. By the time Emma's alarm rang for school, the house already carried the faint smell of motor oil clinging to his work clothes. He sat at the small kitchen table with a steaming cup of black coffee, his eyes heavy but softened when he looked at his children. "Morning, kiddo," he said, ruffling Emma's hair as she shuffled in. Jack stumbled behind her, clutching his favorite toy truck. Those were the moments Emma lived for, the rare mornings when her father was still home before the shop demanded him. He wasn't a man of many words, but his presence filled the room with a quiet safety. Daniel was proud of his work at the auto repair shop, proud of the calluses on his hands that told a story of providing for his family. Still, the hours were long, and the weight of responsibility often pulled him away from the small details of home life. Valerie, on the other hand, moved through the kitchen with a kind of rehearsed grace. Her nails were always painted, her blouse ironed, her voice dripping with cheerfulness whenever Daniel was in the room. "Eat up, kids," she said one morning. placing plates of scrambled eggs in front of them. But when Daniel's phone buzzed with a call from work and he stepped away, her tone shifted ever so slightly. "And don't make a mess this time, Jack," she added, her smile vanishing. Emma noticed everything. She noticed how Valerie's chair was always pulled close to Daniel's at the dinner table, while she and Jack were gently nudged to the side. She noticed how Valerie laughed at Daniel's stories, even when her eyes were cold. She noticed how her stepmother's voice, sweet as honey in front of others, grew sharp like glass when it was just them. Jack was too young to read between the lines, though he flinched whenever Valerie scolded him. "I didn't mean to spill," he whispered one evening, tears brimming in his eyes as milk spread across the table. Emma quickly grabbed a towel to clean it before Valerie could say more. "It's okay, Jack," she whispered, squeezing his hand under the table. Daniel returned home late most nights, his shirt smudged with grease and exhaustion etched into his face. Valerie greeted him at the door with a practiced smile, wrapping her arms around him. "The kids behaved just fine today," she would say, her voice soft and assuring. Daniel nodded, relief flickering in his tired eyes. He wanted to believe it. He needed to believe that while he worked himself to the bone, his children were cared for. Emma often tried to catch his attention, hoping he would notice the unease in her voice or the way Jack clung to her arm. "Dad, can I talk to you?" she asked once, but Valerie quickly cut in. "Emma, let your father eat first. He's exhausted." Daniel gave her an apologetic smile, patting her shoulder. "Tomorrow, kiddo, we'll talk tomorrow." Tomorrow rarely came. The walls of the house seemed to carry two versions of reality: the warm, welcoming picture Valerie painted for Daniel, and the harsher truth Emma and Jack lived when he wasn't there. To outsiders, their home looked picture perfect. But to Emma, it was like standing in a room where the lights flickered, sometimes bright, sometimes dim, never steady. Still, Emma tried to hold on to hope. She told herself that if she was careful, if she kept Jack close and avoided making mistakes, things might remain bearable. Yet somewhere deep inside, she already sensed that the cracks in her family were widening, and one day they would no longer be possible to ignore. It began with little things that seemed almost too small to notice. At dinner one evening, the table was set neatly, the smell of roasted chicken filling the room. Daniel sat at the head of the table, exhausted but smiling faintly as he reached for the serving spoon. Emma waited patiently for her turn, her stomach growling after a long day at school. But when her plate was finally passed, Valerie's voice cut in sharply. "Not so much for her," she said, sliding a piece of chicken back onto the serving tray. "She doesn't finish her food anyway." Emma's cheeks burned, but she lowered her eyes and didn't argue. Jack frowned, glancing at her plate, but said nothing. Daniel, too weary to notice the tension, simply murmured, "Eat up, kids," as he focused on his meal. Later that week, when Jack accidentally spilled juice on the rug, Valerie's face hardened. "Do you know how much this cost?" she snapped, grabbing the paper towels. Jack stammered, "I'm sorry," his small hands trembling. Emma quickly stepped in, kneeling beside him to help blot the stain. "It's just an accident," she whispered to him. Valerie's sigh carried more weight than her words. Accidents happen too often around here. Emma tried to make sense of these moments, telling herself they were isolated, that Valerie was just strict. But in her heart, she felt a shift. Her stepmother's kindness seemed reserved for the outside world, while inside the house grew colder with each passing day. One afternoon, as Emma walked home from school with Jack, their neighbor Mrs. Thompson waved from her porch. The elderly woman, with her grey curls and gentle smile, had always been kind to them. "Emma, sweetheart," she called, "how was school today?" Emma hesitated, her backpack heavy on her shoulders, before forcing a smile. "It was fine, Mrs." Thompson studied her for a moment, noticing the hesitation, the way Emma's eyes darted toward the house. "You know you can always talk to me if something's on your mind," she said softly. Emma nodded, but didn't answer. Jack tugged her hand impatiently, eager to get home, and Emma whispered, "Thanks, Mrs. Thompson," before continuing on. That night, as Daniel returned home later than usual, Valerie greeted him with her usual smile. "The kids were a handful today," she said lightly, her tone playful. "Emma needs to learn some responsibility." Daniel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. She's still young, he murmured, but the conversation ended there. Emma sat quietly in her room, overhearing the muffled voices. She clutched the small photograph of her mother she kept hidden under her pillow. The photo was worn, the edges bent, but it reminded her of a time when love didn't feel like a test. She whispered softly to the picture, "I wish you were here." The neglect wasn't always obvious. It wasn't bruises or shouting, but it was felt in the emptiness of skipped meals, in the absence of comfort when Jack cried, in the way Emma's voice seemed to vanish whenever she tried to speak. The walls of the house absorbed her silence, and the more she held back, the more invisible she felt. Still, there were sparks of resistance. When Jack whimpered one night, afraid of the dark, Emma crawled into his bed and wrapped her arms around him. "I'm here," she whispered. "No one can take that away." Jack buried his face in her shoulder, and for a moment, the weight pressing on her small chest lightened, but even as she comforted him, a gnawing worry lingered in her heart. She could sense something building, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Valerie's subtle cruelty was no longer just irritation, it was turning into a pattern. And deep down, Emma knew that patterns, once formed, rarely disappeared on their own. The change didn't happen overnight, but slowly, day by day, Valerie's grip on the house tightened. Emma noticed it in the little freedoms that slipped away. Where once she and Jack could play outside after school, now Valerie insisted they stay inside, telling them it was too dangerous to be unsupervised. When Emma asked if she could ride her bike down the block, Valerie's answer was sharp. "Not unless your father is home. I don't trust you to be responsible." The fridge, once a place of comfort where Emma could grab an apple or a glass of milk, became another symbol of control. Valerie began keeping it locked with a child-proof strap, tossing the key in her purse. "Snacking spoils dinner," she explained, though dinner itself often arrived late or missing portions. Emma's stomach grumbled in protest, but she learned to silence it. Jack, too small to hide his hunger, would cry softly until Emma distracted him with whispered stories about their mum. It wasn't just about food or play. Valerie began dictating how they spent every hour after school. Homework had to be done at the kitchen table, under her watchful eye, with no room for mistakes. Chores multiplied. Laundry folded with sharp corners, floors scrubbed until they shined, dishes washed twice to meet her standards. When Emma protested, Valerie's voice cut like ice. "This house doesn't run itself. If you want to live here, you'll do your part." Emma tried to keep her head down, but Valerie's disapproval seemed endless. If Jack dropped a spoon, Emma was scolded for not teaching him better manners. If Emma didn't finish a chore on time, Valerie sighed dramatically, muttering, "Your father works so hard, and this is how you repay him." Those words sank deep, filling Emma with guilt she couldn't shake. Yet when Daniel was home, the contrast was jarring. Valerie transformed into sweetness, her voice soft and encouraging. "Emma helped with dinner tonight," she'd say, smiling proudly as if she were nurturing. Daniel, weary from the day, smiled with relief. "Good job, honey," he told Emma, not noticing the way her eyes lowered, too tired to explain the truth. One Friday evening, as the sun dipped low and the air outside turned cool with the promise of autumn, Emma sat quietly at the kitchen table. She traced patterns on the wood grain while Jack hummed beside her, building a tower of blocks. Valerie stood nearby, folding laundry with precise, almost military folds. "You'll need to refold this," she said suddenly, holding up one of Emma's shirts. "Look at these edges, sloppy." Emma's throat tightened. "I tried," she whispered. "Trying isn't enough," Valerie snapped, slamming the shirt onto the table. Jack froze, his tower collapsing with a clatter. He looked up at Emma, wide-eyed, waiting for her to make it better. Later that night, Emma lay awake listening to the house settle into silence. She could hear Valerie's laughter drifting faintly from the living room as she chatted with Daniel. Emma curled closer to Jack, who was already asleep, his breathing steady and peaceful. She envied his ability to escape into dreams, away from the weight of the day. A thought pressed at the edges of her mind, one she tried to push away. Valerie wasn't just strict. She wasn't just firm. She was building walls around them, walls that grew higher every day. And Emma, only 9, felt the crushing weight of being the only one who saw them for what they were. As she closed her eyes, Emma whispered the same promise she always made to Jack. "I won't let anything happen to you." But even as the words left her lips, she wondered how long she could keep that promise when the ground beneath her feet felt like it was shifting. The basement had always unsettled Emma. It was damp, shadowed, and filled with the faint smell of mildew that clung to the old concrete walls. She and Jack avoided going near it, even when Valerie asked them to fetch something from the storage shelves. But lately, the door seemed to hold a darker meaning. It wasn't just another part of the house. It became a symbol of threat, whispered by Valerie, when frustration overtook her. One late afternoon after school, Emma and Jack were tidying up the living room. Jack dropped a toy car that rolled beneath the couch. He bent down to reach it, bumping the lamp and nearly knocking it over. The sound made Emma's heart jump. Valerie's heels clicked across the hardwood as she stormed in. "How many times have I told you to be careful?" Valerie's voice was sharp. She looked at Jack, then at Emma as though both were equally guilty. Emma stepped forward quickly. "It was just an accident. I'll clean it up." Valerie's eyes narrowed, cold and unyielding. "Accidents have consequences. Maybe you two need a little reminder of what happens when rules are ignored." She turned her gaze toward the basement door. Jack froze, clutching Emma's arm. His small voice trembled. "Please, I'll be careful." Emma swallowed hard, trying to keep her own fear hidden. "We'll do better, I promise." Valerie let the silence linger before finally walking away, muttering, "Next time you'll learn in the basement." The words hung heavy in the air, planting seeds of dread that Emma couldn't shake. That night at dinner, Daniel returned earlier than usual. He greeted his kids with a tired smile, kissing the top of Jack's head. "How are things today?" he asked casually, reaching for the breadbasket. Emma's heart pounded. She wanted to speak, to tell him about Valerie's threat, but Valerie was quicker. "They were fine, just a little careless. I told them we'd need to work on responsibility." Her voice was smooth, calm, almost playful. Daniel chuckled lightly. "Kids will be kids." He ruffled Jack's hair and turned his attention back to his meal. Emma looked at him, her lips parting to say more, but Valerie's eyes caught hers across the table. That look was enough to silence her. She lowered her gaze, stabbing at her food without appetite. Later that evening, Daniel called Emma into the garage while he checked on his tools. "You're awful quiet tonight," he said, adjusting a wrench in his hand. "Everything okay?" Emma hesitated. The words pressed against her chest, but fear kept them trapped. She forced a small nod. "Yeah, I'm fine." Daniel sighed, clearly unconvinced, but too drained to push further. "You know you can always come to me, right?" "Yes, Dad," Emma whispered, though deep down she wondered if he would truly hear her if she did. As she walked back into the house, she glanced at the basement door, closed and still. To anyone else, it was just wood and metal hinges, but to Emma it loomed larger every day, an unspoken warning of what might come if she or Jack slipped again. That night, lying awake in bed, Jack whispered into the darkness, "Emma, do you think she'll put us down there?" Emma pulled him closer, her own heart thudding. "No," she said quickly, though she didn't believe her own words. "I won't let that happen." But as the wind rattled faintly against the windows and the house settled into uneasy silence, Emma knew the threat was real. The basement was no longer just a place for boxes and tools. It had become a shadow over their days, a fear that could turn into reality at any moment. The day Valerie's threat became reality started like any other. The autumn air outside was crisp, leaves scattering across the lawn. But inside the house the atmosphere was heavy. Emma and Jack had finished their homework, their papers stacked neatly on the table, when Jack asked if he could play with his toy truck. His voice carried too much excitement, and the truck's wheels clicked noisily against the hardwood floor. The sound grated on Valerie's nerves. She spun around sharply. "I told you not to make noise when I'm working on my computer," she snapped, her eyes narrowing. "I'm sorry," Jack said quickly, scooping the toy into his arms. His small shoulders hunched. Emma stepped forward. "It's my fault. I should have reminded him." Valerie's lips curved into a cold smile. "You're right, you should have. And since you don't listen, maybe it's time you both learn what consequences look like." Emma's stomach dropped. Her eyes darted toward the basement door. She wanted to argue, to beg, but her voice locked inside her chest. Valerie grabbed the key from her pocket, walked briskly to the door and flung it open. The smell of damp air drifted upward like a warning. Down. Both of you, Jack whimpered, clinging to Emma's arm. Please, we'll be quiet, he whispered. Emma's legs trembled, but she held his hand tightly. Come on, she whispered, her voice steadier than she felt. Together they stepped onto the creaking stairs, each step colder than the last. Valerie's hand on the door handle above them was the last thing Emma saw before the heavy slam plunged them into darkness. The basement smelled of earth and dust, the kind that clung to the back of the throat. A single window, high above, let in only the faintest thread of fading daylight. Emma blinked, straining her eyes to adjust, while Jack pressed against her side, shaking. I don't like it here, he whispered, his breath quick and uneven. I know, Emma murmured, wrapping her arms around him. She tried to sound calm, though fear thudded in her chest. It's okay. I'm here. The silence was broken only by the drip of water somewhere in the distance. Emma's mind raced. How long would Valerie keep them there? Would their dad come home soon? What if he didn't find them? Jack's sobs grew louder, his cries echoing against the concrete walls. Emma stroked his hair, trying to soothe him. Shh, it's going to be all right. Remember the song Mom used to sing? Her voice cracked, but she began humming the melody anyway, a tune etched into her memory. Slowly, Jack's crying softened, though his body still trembled. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The air grew colder, seeping through their clothes. Emma rubbed Jack's arms, whispering stories about the summer days when they used to run barefoot in the grass, chasing butterflies, when life felt lighter. She spoke not just for him, but for herself, clinging to the warmth of those memories against the chill of the basement. At one point, Jack looked up at her with wide, tear-filled eyes. What if she never lets us out? Emma swallowed hard, forcing her voice steady. She will. Dad will come home and he'll see. He'll know. But in the back of her mind, uncertainty gnawed at her. Valerie had grown so skilled at hiding her cruelty. What if their father never discovered the truth? Emma closed her eyes and tightened her grip on Jack, determined to be the wall between him and the darkness. She whispered once more, almost like a vow, I won't let anything happen to you. And though her words gave Jack enough comfort to rest his head on her shoulder, Emma stared into the shadows, wide awake, wondering how long they could endure. Time moved strangely in the basement. Minutes stretched like hours, and hours felt like days. Emma sat on the cold cement floor with Jack pressed against her side, his head resting on her shoulder. His breathing was shallow, uneven, his small body shivering even though she wrapped her arms tightly around him. Do you think Dad will come soon? Jack whispered, his voice fragile in the silence. Emma hesitated. She wanted to promise him yes, to fill his heart with certainty, but the truth caught in her throat. He always comes home, she said softly. He'll find us. Jack nodded, though his eyes were heavy with doubt. Emma looked up toward the tiny basement window, where the last light of day had faded into dusk. The darkness deepened, pressing closer around them. She fought to stay calm, but every creak of the house above made her flinch. Valerie's footsteps had faded long ago, leaving them in isolation. Her thoughts circled endlessly. What if Valerie lied to her father again? What if he didn't check the basement? She could already imagine Valerie's sweet voice saying, they're spending the night at a friend's house. And Daniel, tired and trusting, would accept it. The thought tightened in Emma's chest like a knot. Jack's quiet sobs broke the silence again. I don't like it here. It's too dark. Emma kissed the top of his head. Close your eyes. Pretend we're camping. Remember when Mom used to set up a tent in the backyard? His sniffles slowed as he whispered, Yeah. With the flashlights and marshmallows? Emma smiled faintly through her own tears. That's right, this is just like that, only without the marshmallows. Jack let out the smallest laugh, and Emma clung to it, grateful for the sound. It reminded her that hope, however fragile, still lived in both of them. But when Jack finally drifted into sleep, Emma was left alone with her thoughts. She leaned her head back against the wall, staring into the darkness. The silence pressed harder, whispering doubts she didn't want to hear. What if they were forgotten? What if Valerie's threats grew worse next time? Her hands clenched into fists. She felt small, powerless, and yet something inside her stirred, a defiance, a quiet flame that refused to die. She thought of her mother, the way she used to tell her stories about brave girls who overcame impossible trials. Maybe I have to be that girl now, Emma thought. Maybe I don't get to wait for someone else to fix this. The hours dragged on, and the chill seeped deeper into her bones. At one point she stood, pacing the small space, her shoes scraping against the concrete. She searched the walls for anything, an opening, a weakness, but found nothing. Defeated, she sank back down beside Jack, pulling him close again. Her mind drifted between hope and despair, like a pendulum swinging without rest. She pictured her father discovering the truth, his strong arms pulling her and Jack into safety. She also pictured the opposite, that he would never see, never believe, and that the basement would always wait for them as punishment. As the night stretched on, Emma whispered to herself as much as to Jack, "You're not alone. I won't let you be alone." The words steadied her, even as fear gnawed at the edges of her courage. When Jack stirred in his sleep, murmuring her name, Emma stroked his hair and whispered again, "I promise I'll find a way to keep us safe." And in the suffocating dark, that promise became more than words. It became the thin thread holding Emma together, the fragile line between despair and the hope she refused to let die. The night dragged on until morning crept into the sky. Emma could hear faint movements above, footsteps, the closing of doors, and the clatter of dishes. She knew Valerie was going about her routine, perfectly calm while they remained trapped below. Emma pressed her ear against the basement door once, straining for any sign of her father's return, but all she heard was silence. Hours passed before the sound of a car pulling into the driveway made her heart leap. Jack stirred, rubbing his tired eyes. "Is that Dad?" he whispered, his voice hopeful but weak. Emma held her breath, listening. The slam of the car door, the jingle of keys. Then, unmistakably, her father's heavy boots crossing the porch. Relief rushed through her veins so quickly it made her dizzy. "Yes, it's him," she whispered, squeezing Jack's hand. Above them, the door creaked open, and Daniel's voice carried into the house. "Valerie, I'm home early today." Jack's face lit up. He opened his mouth to call out, but Emma placed a hand over his lips. "Wait," she whispered. Her instinct told her that Valerie would try to silence the truth before it reached him. Sure enough, Valerie's voice rang out, cheerful and composed. "Welcome home, honey. You're early. How was the shop?" Daniel chuckled softly. "Busy, but I managed to finish sooner. Where are the kids?" Emma's pulse raced. She leaned closer to the door, every word above them like a thread pulling tighter. "They're at a sleepover," Valerie replied smoothly. "You know how excited they get with their friends." Emma felt Jack's body stiffen against hers. His eyes widened in fear. Emma hugged him tightly, her mind spinning. She's lying again, just like always. But then Daniel's voice shifted, touched by curiosity. "A sleepover? On a school night?" There was a pause just long enough for Emma's heart to pound against her ribs. Valerie recovered quickly. "It was a last-minute invitation. I thought it would be good for them. You know Emma, she needs to socialize more." Daniel didn't respond right away. The silence stretched, and Emma clung to it like a lifeline. Then she heard his footsteps moving deeper into the house. Jack tugged her sleeve. "What if he doesn't check?" His whisper trembled with panic. Emma bit her lip. "He will. He has to." She prayed her father would notice something, anything that didn't line up with Valerie's story, and then, as if fate answered her, Daniel's voice carried from the hallway. "Strange. Emma's school shoes are still by the door." Emma's heart skipped. Jack's eyes lit with cautious hope. Upstairs, Valerie laughed lightly, though the edge in her tone was sharp. She must have forgotten them. You know how scatterbrained kids can be. But Daniel didn't sound convinced. Both pairs and Jack's sneakers too? The weight of doubt entered his voice. Emma pressed her ear harder against the wood, desperate to hear more. "Valerie," Daniel said slowly, "are you sure they're at a sleepover?" There was a pause, longer this time. Emma imagined Valerie's tight smile, her mind scrambling for excuses. "They are," she insisted, her voice firmer. "Why don't you sit down? I'll make you some dinner." Emma closed her eyes. She could almost feel the moment hanging in the air above them, fragile as glass. Her father's suspicion had been sparked. Now all she and Jack could do was wait, praying he would follow the trail of doubt straight to the locked door that stood between them and the truth. Daniel's footsteps grew heavier as he walked through the house. Emma clutched Jack's hand so tightly, his fingers turned white. She didn't breathe, afraid even the faintest sound might give them away too soon. "Valerie!" Daniel called again, his voice sharper now. "Whose backpacks are these by the stairs? If they're at a sleepover, why are all their things still here?" Upstairs, silence followed. Emma imagined Valerie's face tightening, the smooth mask she wore beginning to crack. "They left in a hurry," Valerie replied finally, her tone strained. "The kids' friends said they had everything they needed." Daniel's boots shifted across the floor, pacing. His tone carried suspicion now. "Which friends? Emma hasn't mentioned a sleepover in weeks." Emma's heart pounded. She leaned close to the door and whispered into Jack's ear, "He's starting to see." Then came the sound she'd been praying for, the creak of his footsteps moving toward the basement. Every muscle in Emma's body tensed. She wanted to scream, to pound on the door. But fear rooted her in silence. The rattle of the doorknob made her breath catch. It jiggled once, then again. "Why is this locked?" Daniel demanded from above. Valerie's voice rushed in, high and defensive. "Because I keep storage down there. It's dangerous for the kids. You know how curious they get." Daniel interrupted sharply. "Valerie, where are they?" Emma's chest tightened. She could hear his hand fumbling for the key. Valerie's words overlapped, a flurry of excuses. But then the lock clicked. The door swung open. Dim light spilled down the stairs, breaking through the suffocating dark. Emma blinked against it, clutching Jack's trembling frame. Daniel's figure filled the doorway. For a heartbeat, he stood frozen, his eyes wide as they adjusted to the sight below. His children huddled together on the concrete floor, pale and shaking. "Dad!" Jack cried, his voice breaking. He scrambled to his feet, stumbling toward the stairs. Emma followed, though her legs felt heavy, unsteady. Daniel's face shifted from shock to horror, then to something darker, rage and disbelief twisting together. He dropped to his knees, scooping Jack into his arms, then reaching for Emma. "What on earth? Why are you down here?" Emma's words tumbled out, shaky and broken. "She locked us in." "We didn't do anything wrong. She said we had to learn." Valerie appeared behind Daniel, her voice desperate. "They're exaggerating. I only meant—" But Daniel spun, his arms still around his children, his voice thundering louder than Emma had ever heard. "Exaggerating? They're freezing down here. Look at them." Jack buried his face in Daniel's chest, sobbing. Emma clung to her father's sleeve, the weight of silence she had carried for so long finally breaking. "It's true, Dad," she whispered through tears. "She always does this when you're not here." Daniel stared at her, his eyes searching her face as if he needed proof. But the tremor in her voice, the fear etched into every line of her small body, told him everything. Valerie's voice shook now, her confidence unraveling. "I was just trying to teach them discipline. You work so hard, Daniel. I thought—" "Enough." His tone cut like a blade. The basement door stood wide open, the air upstairs warmer, brighter, like a lifeline. But even as Emma stepped into her father's arms, relief flooding her chest, she knew this was only the beginning. The truth was out now, impossible to ignore, and nothing in their home would ever be the same. Daniel stood in the doorway of the basement, his arms wrapped protectively around Emma and Jack. His chest rose and fell with sharp breaths, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. For a long moment the only sound was Jack's muffled sobs against his father's shirt and Emma's uneven breathing. Valerie shifted uneasily, her hand gripping the doorframe as if it might steady her unraveling composure. "What is this?" Daniel's voice boomed, low but thunderous. "Explain to me why my children were locked in a basement." Valerie flinched, her practiced calm slipping. "Daniel, please, you don't understand. They were out of control." I had to do something to make them listen. Emma's small voice broke through the tension. We weren't bad, Dad. She said we needed to learn respect. Daniel looked down at her, his eyes softening for a moment, then turned back to Valerie, fury returning like a storm. Respect? Locking children in the dark isn't respect, it's cruelty. Valerie raised her chin, her words sharper now. You're never here, Daniel. You don't see how defiant they can be. I cook, I clean, I take care of everything, and this is how you repay me, by accusing me of being cruel. Daniel's fists clenched at his sides, but he held his children tighter. Taking care of everything doesn't give you the right to hurt them. Her voice cracked, desperation bleeding through. I wasn't hurting them. I was disciplining them. Kids need structure. Without me, they'd be running wild. At that moment, a knock echoed from the front door. Daniel's head jerked up, his brow furrowing. Valerie froze. Then came the familiar voice of Mrs. Thompson from outside, calling through the glass. Daniel, I heard shouting. Is everything all right in there? Emma's heart leapt. She knew Mrs. Thompson was the one adult who had suspected something was wrong. Daniel turned toward Valerie, his eyes narrowing. Did you hear that? Even the neighbors can tell something isn't right here. Valerie's face flushed red, her composure shattering. She's always meddling. She doesn't know what happens in this house. Daniel marched toward the door, still holding Emma and Jack close. He opened it, revealing Mrs. Thompson standing with concern etched across her face. Her gaze immediately fell on the children, Emma's tear-streaked cheeks, Jack clinging tightly to his father. "Oh, dear Lord," she whispered, stepping closer. What happened? Emma buried her face in Daniel's sleeve, overwhelmed by shame and relief. Jack whimpered, hiding his face. Daniel's voice was heavy, rough. "They were locked in the basement," Mrs. Thompson gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked at Valerie, her eyes sharp. "How could you?" Valerie snapped, her voice shrill. "Stay out of this. This is family business." But Daniel's tone cut through her protest. "No, Valerie, this isn't just family business anymore." The room swirled with emotions. Fear, betrayal, anger, relief. Emma clung to her father's shirt, listening to the adults clash above her, each word carving a new truth into the air. For the first time, she felt like someone else, someone stronger, was standing up for her and Jack. "Daddy," Jack whispered softly, his voice trembling. "Don't let her do it again." Daniel pressed his cheek against his son's hair, his voice breaking. "I won't, buddy. I promise." His promise rang out like a vow, heavy and unshakable. Emma lifted her head, her wide eyes fixed on her father. For the first time in months, she felt a spark of safety, small but real. Yet even as relief washed over her, Emma sensed the battle wasn't finished. Valerie stood only a few feet away, her arms crossed, her voice trembling with anger she couldn't contain. And Emma knew the next words her father spoke would decide what came next. The living room felt smaller than ever. Daniel stood tall, Emma and Jack pressed close to him, while Valerie lingered by the wall, her face tight with anger and fear. Mrs. Thompson hadn't left. Instead, she stood firmly near the doorway, her arms folded, unwilling to walk away from what she had just heard. Daniel's voice was steady now, though the storm in his eyes hadn't faded. "Emma, sweetheart," he said softly, bending slightly to meet her gaze. "I need you to tell me everything. No holding back. I want the truth." Emma froze. The weight of months of silence pressed on her shoulders. She glanced at Valerie, who glared at her, lips pressed tight in warning. Emma's stomach knotted, her throat dry. But then she looked at Jack, still clinging to their father's shirt, his small body trembling. She remembered the nights she had whispered promises to him in the dark. She remembered her vow that she would protect him. Slowly, Emma lifted her chin. "She locks us in the basement when you're not here," she whispered. Her voice shook, but she kept going. "She yells at us, she doesn't let us eat sometimes, and she says it's to teach us." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she didn't stop. "I tried to be quiet, Dad. I didn't want to make things worse, but it kept happening. I didn't know how to tell you." Jack's small voice joined hers, muffled against Daniel's chest. "It's true, Daddy. She scares us." I don't like it when you leave. Daniel's face crumpled, guilt flashing across it like a wound. His arms tightened around both children, pulling them close as if he could shield them from everything they had endured. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I should have seen it. I should have listened sooner." Valerie's voice cut through, high and defensive. "They're lying, Daniel. They've always wanted to turn you against me. I was only trying to give them discipline, structure, something you never had time for." Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, her voice sharp. "Discipline doesn't mean cruelty. I've seen the fear in their faces for months, and I should have spoken up sooner. But don't you dare stand here and pretend this is normal." Emma's eyes widened at the support. For the first time, someone other than her and Jack acknowledged the truth. Daniel turned slowly toward Valerie, his voice low but firm. "You lied to me. You lied every single day while my children suffered." Valerie shook her head, her voice trembling now. "I did what I thought was best." "No!" Daniel snapped, his anger erupting. "What you did was abuse. You don't get to dress it up as discipline." The words hung heavy in the air. Emma's heart pounded, but for once it wasn't with fear. It was with relief. Her father believed her. The silence that had trapped her for so long had finally shattered. Daniel knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's tear-streaked face. "You were so brave," he said softly. "I should have protected you better, but I promise you, I will now." Emma threw her arms around his neck, clinging to him, her sobs mixing with Jack's quiet whimpers. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel safe. Valerie's breathing was uneven, her face pale as she realized the control she once held was slipping away. And Emma, though exhausted and scared, knew the tide had turned. The truth was no longer buried. The silence had been broken, and with it came a new beginning, one where she and Jack no longer had to face their fears alone. The morning after the confrontation, the house felt heavier than ever. The silence was not the same one Emma had grown used to. It was charged, fragile, on the verge of breaking again. Daniel had barely slept. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands gripping a mug of cold coffee, his eyes dark and distant. Emma and Jack hovered nearby, too afraid to stray far from him. Valerie paced across the living room, her words sharp and frantic. "Daniel, you can't just throw everything away because of a misunderstanding. They're children. They exaggerate, they twist things. I've only ever tried to help." Daniel's voice cut through her excuses, steady and firm. "Locking kids in a basement is not helping. It's abuse." Emma flinched at the word, though she knew it was true. She looked at Jack, who pressed closer to her, his wide eyes filled with confusion. Mrs. Thompson appeared at the back door, her face set with quiet determination. "I called someone," she said softly. "They'll be here soon. These children need to be heard by people who can protect them." Valerie spun toward her, her voice rising. "You had no right—" "I had every right, Mrs." Thompson interrupted, her voice steady. "When children are in danger, silence is not an option." Not long after, a knock came at the door. A woman with a kind face and a clipboard introduced herself as a social worker, accompanied by a uniformed officer. Emma's chest tightened, fear flooding her at the sight of strangers, but the woman's gentle smile calmed her. "Emma," she said softly, kneeling to meet her eyes, "we're here to listen. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Emma's throat tightened. She glanced at her father, who gave her a small nod. Taking a shaky breath, she began to speak. She told them everything. How Valerie locked the fridge, how she yelled, how she shut them in the basement. Her voice trembled, but once she started, the words poured out like a flood that had been waiting too long. Jack added his small voice, clutching his toy truck tightly. "She said we were bad, but we weren't. We just wanted to play." The social worker's eyes softened with sadness, her pen moving swiftly across the paper. "You were very brave to tell me this," she said. Daniel's face was etched with guilt as he watched. He rubbed his temples, muttering under his breath, "I should have seen it sooner." The officer spoke firmly to Valerie, who stood pale and trembling, her words faltering now. "Ma'am, you'll need to come with us. These allegations are serious." Valerie's composure shattered. "Daniel, you can't let them take me." "You know I was only trying to help." Daniel's voice was heavy, resolute. "What you did was hurt them. I won't let you near my children again." As Valerie was led out, Emma felt a strange mix of fear and relief. Her heart pounded, but for the first time she believed the danger might finally be leaving. The social worker crouched again beside Emma and Jack. "You're safe now," she said softly. "For your dad will take care of you, and we'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but they were different this time. Tears of release, of a weight finally lifting. She leaned into her father's side, whispering, "We told the truth, Dad." Daniel's arm wrapped around her and Jack, pulling them close. His voice was thick, breaking with emotion. "And I'll never let anyone silence you again." In that moment, the house didn't feel like a cage anymore. It felt like the start of healing, fragile, but real. The days that followed felt strange, as if the house itself was learning how to breathe again. The silence that once carried fear now carried exhaustion, but also a faint trace of peace. Valerie was gone, and though her absence lifted the immediate threat, the shadows she left behind lingered. Daniel tried to fill those shadows with his presence. He rearranged his schedule, cutting back on extra shifts at the garage, determined to be home when Emma and Jack returned from school. Still, guilt clung to him like oil on his hands. He often sat quietly at the kitchen table, watching his children as if afraid to blink, as though they might disappear if he didn't keep his eyes on them. "I should have noticed sooner," he admitted one evening, his voice heavy. "You were trying to tell me, Emma, and I didn't listen." Emma looked down at her plate, pushing her peas into a pile. "I was scared," she said softly. "I didn't think you'd believe me." Daniel's chest tightened. He reached across the table, his rough hands covering hers. "I'll always believe you now, no matter what. You and Jack come first. Always." Jack nodded, though he was quieter than usual. The little boy who once filled rooms with laughter and toy truck noises now stuck close to Emma, hesitant to leave her side. At night he crept into her bed, whispering, "Don't let me be alone." Emma never refused him. She wrapped her arms around him and whispered back, "You're safe now." But in the quiet of those nights, she wondered if safety was something that could ever truly return. Daniel reached out for help, setting up therapy sessions for both children. The first time Emma entered the small office with its shelves of books and box of toys in the corner, she froze. The therapist's gentle smile invited her to sit, but her chest felt tight. Talking about what had happened meant reliving it. "It's okay if you don't want to say much today," the therapist told her kindly. "We can take it slow." Emma nodded, unsure. But over time she began to speak. First about her mother's lullabies, then about the nights in the basement, then about the fear that lived in her chest even when the sun was shining. Each word was like a stone lifted from her small shoulders. Jack found comfort too, though in his own way. The school counselor let him draw during their talks, and slowly his drawings shifted from dark, messy scribbles to pictures of playgrounds and sunny days. One afternoon, he proudly showed Emma a crayon picture of the two of them standing under a big tree, their father beside them. "See?" he said, smiling shyly. "It's us now." Emma smiled back, her heart swelling with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The community rallied around them as well. Mrs. Thompson often brought warm casseroles or cookies, not just to feed, but to remind them they weren't alone. Neighbors offered rides, teachers offered encouragement, and little by little Emma realized that kindness could be louder than cruelty. Still, healing wasn't simple. Sometimes Emma woke in the middle of the night, heart racing, certain she heard the basement door creak. Sometimes Jack flinched when a voice rose too loud, but each time Daniel was there to hold them, whispering, "It's over. You're safe." The wounds were real, but so was their strength. Emma began to see that even broken things could be mended, and sometimes the scars made them stronger. And though the past still lingered like a shadow, Emma was learning to walk toward the light, one step, one word, one promise at a time. Winter came early that year, blanketing the Ohio neighborhood in crisp frost. The cold air stung cheeks, But inside Daniel's house, warmth was beginning to return, not just from the heater, but from something deeper. Emma had changed. She was still only 9, but the way she carried herself felt older, steadier. She woke each morning determined to keep moving forward, to protect Jack, but also to allow herself moments of joy she once thought were gone. At school, her teachers noticed. Mrs. Keller, her homeroom teacher, pulled Daniel aside one afternoon. "Emma's been more talkative lately," she said with a smile. "She even volunteered to read aloud in class today. She's finding her voice." Daniel nodded, pride and relief softening the weariness in his eyes. "She's been through a lot," he admitted. "But she's stronger than I ever realized." Emma wasn't the only one growing. Jack, who once clung to her constantly, started making friends on the playground again. He still sought her hand when he was nervous, but his laughter was louder now, more frequent. The sound was like music to Emma's ears. At home, their routines shifted. Daniel cooked simple meals with them at the table, teaching Emma how to season chicken, letting Jack mash potatoes until he giggled at the mess. In the evenings, instead of silence, the house filled with stories, board games, and the occasional argument about bedtime. One night, as Emma dried the dishes, she glanced at her father. "You don't work late as much anymore," she said quietly. Daniel looked at her, his expression serious. "I miss too much, Emma. I don't want to miss anything else." Her heart warmed. She nodded, whispering, "I'm glad." The community support never wavered. Mrs. Thompson became almost like a grandmother to the children, inviting them over for cookies and homework help. At church, neighbors offered gentle encouragement, reminding Daniel he wasn't alone in rebuilding his family. But resilience wasn't about ignoring the past. Emma still had nights where fear crept in. Once, when a storm rattled the basement windows, she froze, her body stiff with memories. Daniel noticed and knelt beside her. "You're safe," he said softly, his voice steady. "That basement doesn't hold you anymore. It never will again." Emma breathed deeply, letting his words sink in. Slowly the trembling eased. She realized healing wasn't a straight path. It was a journey of facing fears again and again until they lost their power. Therapy sessions became less about retelling pain and more about building tools. Emma learned how to name her feelings, how to take deep breaths when fear tightened her chest. Jack drew brighter pictures, full of sunlight and smiling stick figures, his crayon family always standing together. One evening, Emma found herself standing by the window, watching the first snowflakes drift down. Jack ran to press his face against the glass. "Snowball fight tomorrow," he shouted with excitement. Emma laughed, a real laugh, light and free. For a moment the weight lifted completely, and she let herself feel like a child again. Daniel, watching them from the couch, whispered more to himself than to anyone else, "We're going to be okay." Emma turned, catching his words, and nodded. "We already are." The shadows of the past hadn't disappeared, but they no longer ruled the house. In their place, a new strength had taken root, a resilience born not just from surviving, but from choosing to live fully again. And as Emma held Jack's hand, listening to his eager plans for snowmen and forts, she realized that hope wasn't something distant. It was right there in the warmth of their home, in her father's steady promise, in her own unshakable heart. Spring arrived, and with it a gentle easing of the tightness that had lived in their home. The routines Daniel rebuilt, such as slow dinners, Saturday pancakes, and walks to the park, became anchors that made days feel predictable in the best way. Emma felt the shift, not as a sudden relief, but as a steady strengthening inside her chest. Her voice, once cautious and small, began to widen into opinions at school and questions at the dinner table. When she argued about a history assignment or suggested a movie for family night, Daniel would smile as if discovering a new side of her, and Jack would clap like any little brother proud of his sister. Therapy was not a miracle, but a map. Emma filled pages in her journal with lists of things she liked and things that scared her, then practiced breathing exercises until the sharp edges of panic smoothed enough to find a way forward. Jack learned to trust the school counselor and told stories about dinosaurs and playground politics instead of the trembling memories he had once carried in his fists. Mrs. Thompson's casseroles and careful listening remained constants. Neighbors checked in with casseroles and offers to babysit so Daniel could work without fear that old patterns would return. The legal process that followed Valerie's removal was awkward and slow, a string of interviews and papers that made Daniel limp through guilt and responsibility, but ultimately it affirmed that the children's safety mattered beyond private apologies. Daniel learned to listen better, to check the small things Emma had pointed to before, to ask questions without defensiveness, and to believe even when the answers were hard. He apologized without excuses and promised routines that meant presence, school pickups reading 2 chapters each night, and a weekly park day where laughter was required and nothing dangerous could happen. Emma honored her mother in private ways, humming lullabies while she tucked Jack in, wearing a small necklace on hard days, and publicly by deciding to fight for other kids who might not know how to speak. She joined a neighborhood volunteer group that visited the school, sitting quietly while adults planned support programs, learning that bravery sometimes looks like steady presence rather than shouting. On the anniversary of that terrible night, Daniel organized a small ritual, candles on the kitchen table and extra hugs before bed, so the day would not be defined by fear, but by the fact that they had survived together. Emma lit a candle and thought of her mother, not in sorrow alone, but in fierce gratitude for the lesson she had taught without meaning to, that love is a decision and protection is work. There were scars, visible in the way Emma flinched at sudden slams and private in the nights she woke, thinking the house had closed in again. But those scars did not define her. They were reminders that she had survived and chosen to keep living. When neighbors complimented Daniel on his dedication, he would shrug and say, "I should have been there sooner," but then add, "I'm here now." A sentence that felt like an offering and a promise. Emma believed him, not because he never made mistakes, but because he now let her speak and he listened. On a bright afternoon, Emma and Jack sat in the yard with other kids, trading jokes and daring one another to build higher block towers. A neighbor called out, "Look at them normal kids," and Daniel answered with a grin that held equal parts relief and stubborn pride. Emma glanced at her father and then at Jack, feeling a fierce contentment she could name only as enough. She whispered to Jack, "We kept our promise," and he smiled, the kind of smile that healed small parts of both of them. Before we close, please subscribe to the channel to support real stories of survival and healing. Click the suggested video to continue watching stories that show how courage quietly grows everywhere now.